Good evening, and welcome to the SilmFilm Project Script Discussion Season 1, Episode 11. We're going to be discussing Aule and the creation of the dwarves tonight. Hopefully, we'll be joined a little bit later. It was interesting doing my first solo foray last week. Hopefully, that's not repeated this week because it was a little stressful. So hopefully we get a couple more people up in here in a little bit. So I think for this episode, there was some stuff that I wanted to go over about last episode to kind of block it out, but I want to kind of, for the moment, while it's just we've got Karita Alexander in the chat, so it's just the two of us at the moment. I'd like to kind of dive right into the episode and get started there before we kind of go back and deal with things that have kind of already been gone over. So for this episode, we're going to have a bit more frame here than we've had in the past, like 2 or 3 episodes, because the goal here is to have the frame be the chapter in The Hobbit where Bilbo and the dwarves visit Rivendell on their way out to Erebor. So, the question that comes up is, how does this take place? How do we set up this happening? How does it initially become apparent to Estelle? So one of the things that has been brought up that I kind of like is the idea of having Estelle on his way to his lesson bump into Bilbo, and maybe Estelle doesn't know the dwarves are there. No, because I think he kind of has to know that they're there at that point for him to be able to talk to Bilbo about the dwarves. He needs to know that they're there. Do we know the time of day it was when the dwarves arrive in Rivendell? I feel like it was the evening, but I'm not entirely certain. No, I don't want that. I'm trying to pull up my my Kindle version of The Hobbit as I'm speaking. But if it's in the evening, then we can have a kind of hurried entrance of the dwarves into Rivendell, and have Estelle seeing this, but no real explanation is given to him as to what's going on. And maybe we hear the elves kind of poking fun at the dwarves as they're coming in. But we don't. Nobody explains to him what's going on, or who they are, or what they're doing there. So if we do that, if the next morning he can bump into Bilbo and start asking him questions about it, it kind of gives it a little bit more background, but it doesn't give it so much background that he's kind of already had the opportunity to ask whatever questions he wants to ask. It was after tea time, so early evening then. Not even, probably like 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I imagine. Okay. But we can assume it's after his lesson for the day. We'll start to wonder if they would miss supper. Yeah. So we could assume probably at 5 or 6 in the evening. Okay. So we could assume then that the majority of the time, if we have Estelle set up with his mother in a separate little home of their own, we can assume that most evenings he takes dinner with his mother. which would, basically give us the opportunity for him to be, to be gawking at them. And Gilrine pulls him away for dinner. Could we have... I wonder if we could have Gilrine mildly suspicious of them. I don't know. What do you think? I imagine that there's a hubbub happening due to the arrival of the dwarves. He might go to the window. So maybe it happens around the time that they're having an evening meal. That's not a bad idea. Yeah. Okay. So if we do that, then excuse me. Then he's gonna ask Gilrine, what they are. She'll just say they're dwarves. They're just dwarves. That she may not know all the particulars. She may not know why they're there. I imagine not. The only way that she would know for certain is if she were privy to information about Gandalf's doings and whereabouts, which I don't think is something that's a really big deal to her. Give me 1 second. I have to check on something real quick. Okay, Karita says, I don't know offhand how much back and forth Gilrine and her family would have had with dwarves, or what those interactions would have been like, so I don't know how she would feel about the dwarves. Okay, that's probably pretty fair. Deciding how to introduce the dwarves. Yeah. Marie, where are you? All right. So we need to I don't think there's going to be anything that's written down about how Gilrine would feel about the dwarves. But I feel like we can take a little bit of artistic license in this case, considering that there's no information. I would say that maybe she just doesn't care about them. Like, they don't matter to her that much. I mean, not in the sense that, she wouldn't help one with a broken leg or something like that. But what I mean is she doesn't, they don't affect her world, if that makes any sense. So if they don't affect her world, maybe what she needs to do is when Estelle asks her, hey, what's going on out there? Aha, who's here? If Estelle asks, what's going on out there, she can say, well, that's strange. Those are dwarves coming in. And he says, dwarves, what are they doing here? And she says, I don't know. Eat your dinner. We're gonna have to ask. Hold on a second. Okay, so we're trying to work on setting up the opening of the frame, and so obviously we want to have dwarves. So, and I had remembered, and I think this was your idea of having Estelle bump into Bilbo.
Yes.
And to kind of introduce that.
Yes, mostly because Bilbo would be someone who's interested in meeting new people, whereas the dwarves are all like paranoid and keeping to themselves.
Yes, absolutely.
So Estelle can observe the dwarves, but I wouldn't really see him directly interacting, other than to maybe say hello and have them look at him weird, and that'd be it.
So what I was thinking, because it occurred to me that unless there happen to be dwarves that he can see at the moment that he bumps into Bilbo, there has to be some kind of setup. Karita says Bilbo and Estelle are more likely to poke around and run into each other. Yeah, absolutely. But to give Estelle kind of a setup to his curiosity about them, if the cottage, if Gilrain's cottage is near to a gateway, and the dwarves are coming in, which we have discovered is after tea time and approaching a point where Bilbo would be worried about missing dinner.
Yes.
They could actually already be sitting down to an evening meal, the two of them, and Estelle sees them tramping through, and he's like, "What's that? What's going on?" And Gilrain's basically, I mean, not in so many words, but she's basically like, "I don't know what's going on. Sit down and eat your dinner."
One way to do that that wouldn't make her completely a jerk about it would be to have him be outside watching this, and she's in the house getting dinner ready. So she's like, "Come in, it's time to eat." And he's like, "But she's like, "Whatever, come in, there's not," so she doesn't see it.
Go around about it in the morning. Yes, absolutely.
So I think that there is the opportunity. Oh, wait, what does Karita say?
Is Estelle old enough to be too polite to ask Bilbo, "Why don't you have a beard?" Because I think that would be funny. I think that would be hilarious.
Yeah, and he's not too old. He's only 10. And 10-year-olds still have very direct questions.
Yes. Although I think the phrasing of the question should be, "What happened to your beard?"
Well, because the idea was that he's going to mistake Bilbo for a dwarf.
Right.
And Bilbo's going to mistake him for an elf.
Yeah.
Like
so, although would Bilbo know whether or not elves actually grow up from children?
Bilbo's never seen elves before, right? He's heard of elves, but he's
heard of them, right? But they're almost like, mythical. They're almost. I mean, he knows they're out there. They're probably out there. He's heard of them, but they are kind of mythical, and it's almost like Native American cultures who had heard about contact with Europeans before, but they had never actually made contact, so they kind of heard that there were these people out there with pale skin and weird weapons that went boom, but they'd never seen them, so they didn't really know if these people were even really human and how much like themselves they were.
Right. I mean, they were legendary to a point, and I think that to Bilbo, the elves are quite legendary, and he's totally fascinated by their song and wants to stay and listen, but the dwarves are moving along and everything. So he's interested and wants to learn more, but doesn't know much to begin at this point. And Karita says, I mean, Bilbo is dressed like a dwarf and surrounded by dwarves, so it's a logical mistake. And Estelle is a pretty enough kid and dressed like an elf. Again, logical mistake. Yeah. So
I mean, it could be. I wouldn't want to, because to be honest, if I were in Bilbo's shoes, I might not consider it a foregone conclusion that elves have children and grow up from children. You know what I mean? And I might be overthinking this. I'm also aware.
No. I see where you're coming from, because elves are like timeless and ancient, and the idea of an elf child might be like, oh wow, an elf child. But that would be all the more reason for him to want to go up and talk to Estelle. Like, wow, an elf kid. I never met one of those.
Yeah.
I think he would jump to the conclusion that elves have kids if he sees an elf kid, but still be a little surprised by it.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Elves have kids.
Right.
It's kind of like, oh, that's interesting. Duck-billed platypuses lay eggs. It's not quite that weird, but I mean...
Something that's unusual and surprising, but if you see it, you're like, okay, yeah, I get it.
I guess that makes sense, yeah. Karita says, and since they're aren't a bunch of humans running around. Elves have kids makes more sense than, look, a random human. Yeah, that's true. Unless although it's also possible he might assume he's something completely different. But jumping to the idea of elves have kids is certainly a more plausible idea than, some random species of thing I've never heard of before.
Right. And I think the idea of mistaking Estelle for an elf will help with what we're trying to tell in the frame story of is Estelle growing up as a human or an elf?
Right.
To have him be mistaken for an elf is like, oh, that's why this actually matters, because he kind of looks like an elf and talks like an elf and plays with the elves. And how is he not an elf again?
Yeah. So if we set up with Estelle seeing the dwarves the evening before, he bolts out of the house the next morning.
Yeah.
Here's something. What if Bilbo is like approaching the cottage like, this is a little weird? You know? Because here's the thing. In my head, the cottage, if the cottage is made to look like a human cottage, it should be what elves think human cottages are like. So like the prototypical human cottage. Like,
okay.
Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just really human. Like when, if you could imagine in the 50s, if a very middle-class American family invited a Mexican family over, they might do things that they thought were to make the Mexican family feel comfortable, like having bizarre Mexican-looking decorations and you know.
I see where you're going with this. An outsider trying to design something within another culture to look like it's from that culture. Like, ooh, I've studied this. I know what it's supposed to look like. Like, you know, if I were to make an African mask.
Yeah, actually.
I've seen African masks. I know a little bit about the materials and the color schemes, and I could probably make one that looks more or less like an African mask. But it's totally removed from the cultural context, so I'm probably going to get stuff wrong.
And somebody who has actually worn real African masks with any kind of regularity would look at it and be like,
that one's weird.
Clearly not.
Right, exactly. Like, so I see that's what you mean of an outsider trying to do something.
Yeah.
So it would be a human cottage with elvish touches to it that they didn't realize don't belong on a human cottage, because to them that was just a normal thing about cottages.
Krita says this does raise the question of what we are imagining this dwelling to look like. I'm not thinking that it looks like significantly. I mean, it looks somehow bizarre, but it should just be a little bit.
Okay, I am imagining it looks like a cottage from the Cotswolds. So like a thatched roof, and like that real thick thatched roof, and lots of flowers in the yard. It looks like a Thomas Kincaid painting or something.
And like the stone, the stone bricks. But if like all the bricks are like perfect.
Oh, right, because they're being human.
Right, but in reality, if you were making a cottage like that, you would just build it out of stones that you found that were generally brick shaped and put them on top of each other, and it would be a little slipshod, which the elves would be like, well, this isn't the right way to do this, let's just make it straight.
My one reason not to have Bilbo go to the cottage at any point is that all of our descriptions of Riddell are from the point of view of hobbits, right? Bilbo's visit, Frodo's visit, and at no point are there any outbuildings mentioned.
That's true.
It's just Elrond's house. Yes. Right? And everyone lives in Elrond's house, and they stay in Elrond's house.
Right. Okay.
And when Frodo wakes up, he's in a room in Elrond's house. Yeah. So given that, it's not that we can't have a cottage there, but if Bilbo actually knocked on the door and had tea in this cottage, it kind of doesn't fit.
Okay. Fair point.
But it doesn't mean we can't do that. Right. That would be my reason to hesitate.
Okay.
But anyway, Phil runs out the door to meet these new dwarf people, and Bilbo is wandering around Rivendell going, wow, what an awesome place.
Right, yeah. Probably just back from the dining hall and dabbing a napkin at his cheeks or something like that.
Because Bilbo Hobbit
right
food.
Yeah, of course. Well, you have to set that up because there's absolutely no context for hobbits in the story that we're telling, so we have to kind of set some of this up. As far as we're probably going to, because I know they want Sam to be the storyteller of next season.
Yeah, I know they do.
How accurate a narrator is Sam going to be, though?
Well, if he uses Bilbo's translations from the Elvish, he can read the stories right out of there.
He's fine. There you go.
I'm just having trouble with Sam telling the story of the fall of the Noldor. Yeah. I mean, of all narrators and contents, it just does not match.
Kirita says, I thought you were going to live here, and Bilbo saying, I'd like that. Maybe I will be back someday. Ooh.
Oh, right. The idea of Estelle's a permanent resident, and Bilbo's a temporary visitor.
Although I feel like that would be good on the way back.
Oh, yeah, maybe later, because Estelle has seen people come and go before. Like, there's gates in Rivendell, people enter, people leave. So he wouldn't assume that everybody who walks through the gate's going to live there.
Okay.
But if Bilbo comes back a second time, it's like, oh, are you here to stay now? Would be maybe a little bit like, now that your quest is done, surely you came back to hang out with us. Of course. And it's like, no, I'm going to my own home.
It would be kind of cool to have Estelle running up to him, Bilbo.
Yeah.